Hi, this is Delegate Steve Aarons, District 36, representing Kent, Queen Anne, Cecil, and Caroline counties, and you're listening to the Maryland Association of Counties podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Conduit Street Podcast. Kevin Kinnally here with my co-host Michael Sanderson and our guest today, Dominic Butchko. And today we're talking about and taking a deep dive into Maryland's energy landscape and what's ahead in the 2025 legislative session. We all know that energy demand is rising, federal mandates are shifting the game, and Maryland's ambitious climate goals are adding layers of complexity. We're here to break it all down for you. And as I said, joining me are Michael Sanderson and Dominic Butchko. Let's jump right into it. Michael, start us off here. Give us the history. You're the guru. You've been here forever. It's sort of our shtick. So give us your global view on renewable energy, clean energy in Maryland and where we are right now.
I mean, I think we can kind of go piece by piece and lay the groundwork for why this issue is fired up right now and why some Marylanders are focusing on it and why we think policymakers are going to focus on it. But just in the broader context, I've been at MACo for a really long time. We have not really spent an awful lot of time talking about energy policy as really a county issue over my, now like 30 years with MACo. It just hasn't really been a county government matter. When the state sort of broke up the power industry and said electric supply is going to be deregulated, that was a big policy issue, and we were players there, and mostly tax consequences, but some administrative stuff. But it's not like a big part of MACo's portfolio is going to committees in Annapolis and testifying on bills that are about the power supply or the energy grid or that kind of stuff. So this isn't really common territory for us. But boy, have we been hearing a lot about energy policy the last couple of years. And this year, MACo goes out every year and we meet with the county governing bodies of every jurisdiction. And we just finished that tour a few weeks ago to visit every single county. And boy, I'm not sure how many counties didn't raise, whether it's the siting of new facilities, whether it's transmission lines, or just pressure on people's electric bills. This kind of stuff is on a lot of people's minds in the counties, in the communities, and some of it is at least adjacent to county government policy. So I like the idea of tying it all together with a rundown here. So I'm into it.
And Dom, you've been following and covering energy issues for MACo. You've been involved in multiple stakeholder meetings. I feel like much of your interim has been centered around energy and energy policy. So where should we start with this, Dom?
Yeah, so energy is really the only thing I talk about, I feel like, this year. And so when we break it down, there's a number of buckets. I think the first bucket we should start with is transmission infrastructure. And so these are those big power lines. Primarily, they're 69 kilovolts or higher, and they're the ones that kind of make sure the energy gets from the facility that produces it to, a smaller facility that then transmits it to your home. But these big kind of transmission projects are really important and they're critical. Big thing for our county folks and for everyone to kind of ground their understanding, counties have virtually no say in these projects. It's primarily regulated and decided at the federal level. There is some state and regional input, primarily in Maryland through the PJM, which is the organization that organizes the multi-state transmission network. It goes from Maryland past New York and then a little bit into Illinois. So really that whole Northeast. But really it's at the federal level that a lot of these major transmission plans and decisions are being made, not at the county level and really not in Annapolis either.
Right. And that's like a stutter step for a lot of people who are finding themselves caught up in energy policy. I mean, right now we know that there's a big proposed project that's going to cross right over sort of the north center part of the state of Maryland. And this big project is basically being initiated under the direction of this multi-state regency. We call it PJM. It's Pennsylvania, Jersey, Maryland, but then it reaches out through Ohio and into the Midwest. It's kind of a weird diagram when you look at these multi-state entities. But basically, all the power companies agree to be under the charter of this big entity that's supposed to look at capacity and transmission across a large area. mostly so you don't end up with like tiny little islands all having to fend for themselves. You end up with 6 or 7 states all kind of pitching in to say, let's make sure we have general capacity to cover all the people over this large region. And occasionally that means we need a high transmission facility to get from point A to point B. And, the issue of the moment is one that comes through Maryland, even though it's basically taking electrons from Pennsylvania and bringing them to Northern Virginia. It's not really even a Maryland project. But you're right. Like the Piedmont Reliability Project is the one that I'm mentioning, and that folks in some of our Maryland counties are all fired up about. It's controversial here in Maryland, but this is just a sign of the times. Like, this isn't a function of Maryland demand. It's not a function of land use planning in Maryland gone sideways or gone wrong. This is just sort of, these are going to be growing pains as appetite for more and more energy, including some new sectors that are high users. It's just going to continue to grow. The arrow is up here.
Right. And I mean, like you said earlier, Michael, I mean, talking to county elected officials across the state, energy is a huge, huge issue, whether it's land use and, Dom, you're talking about the transmission infrastructure. And Michael, you mentioned the Piedmont Reliability Project, and that is what's drawing a ton of interest. And I mean, I guess I'll throw this out there. Maryland imports 40% of its energy, right? And with rising demand from data centers, electric vehicles, very aggressive climate goals, the state and the region rely heavily on these transmission projects to meet future needs. And again, we know that's regional, but Maryland isn't getting anything from this project, right? It's essentially just an extension cord to help power data centers in Virginia, and with little direct benefit to Maryland residents or our businesses. So why should Marylanders care about projects like the Piedmont Reliability Project if the energy isn't staying here, Michael? I mean, I can understand, number one, people are upset, and I think we'll get into this a little bit more about eminent domain, but once you peel back the layers even further and people realize, wait a second, this isn't benefiting our state at all. And I think the governor has started to raise those issues as well recently. But why should Marylanders care about this, Michael? And why should Marylanders be asked to bend over backwards to accommodate data centers in Virginia?
Yeah, there's the rub. Like being part of a multi-state region and being part of, this is like tens of millions of Americans served under the PJM region have basically said the regional approach is going to make more sense than having Pennsylvania regulate its own, and Maryland regulate its own, and Virginia regulate its own, and New Jersey do its own, and so forth. But then you end up with a situation like this, where a particular project might not be driven by your needs, but by those of your neighbors. And it's an inconvenience, or it's a pain in the neck in your neighborhood. And you feel like, well, this is a mess. But it's kind of a comes around, goes around situation to some degree, right? Right. Surely there have been times. We are a net importer of energy. The state of Maryland is. We use more than we generate. So there's infrastructure in other places, like in Pennsylvania, that has been built to bring electrons to Maryland because we need more than we've got. So, we collectively benefit from this regional approach in a variety of ways. But, at this moment, it feels awkward to say, well, why should we accept this, this clumsy and potentially unwelcome structure and high voltage, and it feels like it might be dangerous or an eyesore or bad for the neighborhood or bad for agriculture or whatever, through parts of our big counties right across the middle of the state. I get where people are coming from. Far be it for MACo to say the Marylanders are wrong here, but this stuff is going to happen one way or another, right? The demand for electrons, the demand for electricity on a reliable grid is going to be there. It's going to grow. So it's going to happen one way or another. I just, I understand the sensitivity over this project, and I get where the neighborhoods are coming from. But, I think the governor saying you haven't given fair deference to where Maryland fits here makes sense, but I don't know how many alternatives there are.
Right. And that does bring us to a critical tension here. And that is that counties are often on the receiving end of large energy projects or infrastructure, but they're expected to accommodate them with very limited authority or input. Right, Dom? And that is the tension that we're experiencing right now on all things energy, it seems.
Exactly. The concerns that we're hearing about these projects, whether they're the eminent domain with the transmission lines or whether they're the large solar projects taking over farmland or sensitive ecological lands, they aren't necessarily coming from counties themselves. I think it's important to remind everyone, counties don't actually have opinions. They're government entities that are informed by their residents, their community stakeholders, et cetera. And we are hearing from the people that we represent, our mutual constituents to the folks in Annapolis, that there are some folks out there, a considerable number, that have heartburn. I do want to underline an important point in the energy conversation because we're talking about land use a little bit, and so some history here. In Maryland, most land use decisions are handled at the county level, except for energy. And for most residents, for most people in your average neighborhood, they don't really understand that. They think, I have a land use issue. I have an issue in my community. I'm going to go to the county planning office. I'm going to go to my county council member. But for energy generation or transmission, I mean, transmission, federal level. But since 2019, in the perennial case, the Board of County Commissioners of Washington County versus Perennial Solar, since 2019, the courts have preempted local governments from making, most of these decisions around energy siting. And I think that's just an important thing to highlight for everyone, why there's so much consternation. Land use in Maryland has a specific thought out process that we've used for generations, but this very narrow but important use, we're now seeing it go more and more through this unique process. And the communication of that hasn't gotten out. And so that's where a lot of this heartburn is coming from.
Right. No, I think that's it's easy to miss some of the nuts and bolts here. So that's a really good point to reinforce. But if you're an active member of your community and you're on your homeowners association board, or you pay attention to the goings on of your local county commissioners or your county council, and you're used to showing up when there's going to be a new development project, and you're like, hey, I'm worried about parking in my neighborhood, or I'm worried about there being overflow on the traffic routes that I take. You are used to going to your county officials. In some cases, it would be your town, your municipal officials. But for most of Maryland, you'd go to your county government and say, I'm worried about growth or development. I'm worried about the permits you're offering. So, I want to have input to make sure this isn't going to, interrupt the way that we're living here. And it's supposed to be the county's job to sort of stake out these things and try and receive that community input and guide and shape their community. So we're used to that. That's muscle memory for Marylanders. You go to the county and you tell them what you think they ought to do and not do. But this is the exception to the rule. Energy policy is just on a separate tier, I think, basically for concerns that if you left energy generation, which historically back in the olden times, it used to be big kind of, dirty power plants, right? We're burning coal, we're burning oil. It's going to be a lot of black smoke. And these are going to be arguably unwelcome facilities to generate the electricity we need. What community would want that? It would welcome that? Maybe not many. And if you have a bunch of local places saying, no, thanks, not in my backyard, you end up with maybe your whole state or your whole region underserved. So that was the, historical grounding for having this is not a local decision. This isn't going to go through local permits and local input. It's going to be guided by these higher than thou regions, the multi-state regional agencies. So that's how it happens. But, I think county officials hearing from their communities are reasonable, saying, but we're still worried about quality of life here. We're worried about livability, and we have conservation goals, and this area being targeted isn't a good fit for one thing or another. Yeah, we're worried about the grid and predictability and so forth. But you got to try and balance these things. That's for the most part what you hear on the ground level. But this is kind of above our pay grade, so to speak.
So just to build off of that really quick, Michael, I want to draw an important thing what you said. So first, we're talking about the history of this process, and we're talking single facilities with smokestacks. So you're thinking of a factory, you're thinking of something that let's say it takes up a city block or two. Now we're using rules that were written, let's say in the 1950s, roughly, maybe a little bit earlier than that. We're using that in modern times where now our energy facilities are taking up tens of thousands of acres. And so you can kind of see where in a constituent's mind, there's a bit of a difference between, we have our power facility over here, the size of a factory, and now we're going to have these new massive facilities that we need to electrify, but the impact on the community or multiple communities is definitely different than what we've seen historically, than what these processes were originally set up to kind of evaluate and approve or disapprove of.
Right. I think that's a great point, Dom. And another thing that Michael said, I want to point out the word reasonable. I think what everyone is searching for here at MACo and in Maryland's counties is a reasonable solution. I think there is a reasonable solution here in terms of, hey, maybe we shouldn't put solar on the best soils that we have. Maybe we shouldn't do that. Maybe we should look at other sites. Maybe we should try to put it on brownfields, gray fields, rooftop, parking canopies. I think everybody wants to do that. But of course, if you need a lot of energy and you want to become, you don't want to import as much anymore, then you're going to have to put up some pretty significant facilities. And that's kind of where we are now, right? And that's what we're dealing with. So I want to focus a little bit on basically our energy landscape now. And in the current landscape in Maryland, we have a reliance on natural gas and nuclear energy. That's very well known. But the landscape is changing very fast, right, Dom?
Yeah, so since 2018, Maryland has retired 6,000 megawatts of power, while we've only added 1,600 megawatts of power. And a lot of this comes from our growing demand for electricity. Part of that is from the push for electrification, but also part of that is just pressure to grow that we've seen naturally. Originally we would rely heavily on fossil fuels, but we haven't seen that uptick in nuclear or solar or wind, so we haven't been able to see the growth that we need for demand.
Right. And you mentioned electrification. So for the benefit of our listeners who are not energy policy nerds, as I understand it, the idea is if you have infrastructure that is powered by natural gas, or if you have infrastructure where you have a gas stove or something along those lines, you have steam power, other things like that, you basically are committed to fossil fuels. Like, a gas stove only can be powered through natural gas. And so the only way to power that appliance or that device or whatever is through natural gas, which is a generator of carbon emissions and raises issues environmentally and so forth. But if you can put things onto the electric grid, and you have more opportunities to find clean sources of energy that can power the electric grid, whether it's solar or wind or nuclear or whatever else, but you can find cleaner ways to get stuff onto the electric grid. So one of the steps to make a cleaner emissions universe for Maryland and other places who are trying to target goals like this is make more stuff electric. And that way you won't be tethered to the old fossil fuels and the old carbon emissions. You can latch on to newer and cleaner sources over time. So electrification as a matter of policy, like building standards going forward and so forth, is connected to this, the demand for electricity rising as we try and move away from stuff that's tethered to carbon sources. Maryland has definitely been an aggressive state trying to clean up its use of energy and the emissions from energy and so forth. I know, the most recent wave of state legislation that sets goals for our renewable portfolio standards, basically what components go into the electricity that you can sell on the market in Maryland. A bill from a few years ago, they called it the Climate Solutions Now Act, which had multiple different facets, but one of them was to set a target specifically for solar that we want to get to basically 1/7 of our power coming from solar energy. Over 14% of our power should come from solar by the year 2030. And that at one point sounded like a really far away year, but at the moment that doesn't sound all that far away. 14% or 14.5% coming from solar by 2030 is an aggressive goal that we've already sort of planted a flag on. And Governor Moore has sort of doubled down on some of these goals and said we ought to be able to get to 100% clean sources by 2035. That's just over a decade out. So when we've got ambitious goals saying we want our energy to come from clean sources and that portfolio to be heavy with clean, that's sort of another pressure point on what's already a tricky industry where demand is already rising.
Right, and we're talking about solar, and solar is absolutely central to the state's climate goals. But of course, it doesn't come without its challenges, Dom, and a lot of that is concerning land use, right?
Yeah, so the biggest challenge with solar is the land use aspect of it. Again, like we were saying before, your traditional kind of coal plant or, anything else, it takes up a very small footprint relative to the amount of space you need to generate the same amount of electricity with solar. And so for Maryland, we're a small state with really ambitious goals, one of those being energy, but another one being conservation. We're starting to see a lot of tension between the state's targets and goals here between what's more important. In order to roll out conservation, we need to make sure that that land stays in either agricultural use or is untouched because it's environmentally sensitive. On the flip side, though, a lot of those lands are the best for solar development because they're cheap and they're flat. You can throw some panels down and easily get them connected. Unlike putting it on a rooftop where, that's where we want to drive development. But in order to put solar in those more urban areas, it's incredibly more expensive.
Right.
And then this triggers the same conversation that we've been bumping up against already, that for the most part, communities look to their county leaders to be the ones to say, okay, this is the part of our county that's really should be reserved for agriculture. We're going to go through our zoning process. And when we do our comprehensive plan and mapping and so forth, we're going to say this is zoned ag. We don't want this to become a big box store. We don't want this to become condominiums or a marina or whatever. This is supposed to be agriculture. There's all sorts of, special preferences for taxes and other things like that. But so keep this area of the county agricultural and rural. And that's what we want here. You look to the county to do that stuff. But again, when it comes to energy policy, it's the exception to the rule. And even if you've got your best laid plans for this will be ag only, energy location isn't a county issue. So this is made higher than us. And in some cases, it ends up sort of undermining what your plan had been for preserving your most favorable agricultural locations.
Right, and you can understand, that those plans often have multiple layers. They've gotten a lot of community and stakeholder input. These are, plans that have been developed over time. And then for someone to just step in and say, actually, no, we're not going to do that, that can certainly have ripple effects. And Dom, back to what you said about, conservation efforts. And there are so many things that counties are asked to do right now, including environmental conservation, but also build more affordable housing, right? And to do that, you'd probably need more schools. Right. And how about plant more trees? We know that we want to plant a lot of trees across the state. You need land to do that. Unfortunately, there's not much money coming down for new school construction and other initiatives for which the state would like counties to take on. So you really are left with this struggle of, well, we only have so much land, but every day there's something new that we're being asked to do from the state. And these are all super important things, but it does put counties right in the middle. And when it comes to energy, trying to manage community concerns while having little say in the actual decisions. And of course, that can frustrate residents because, as we mentioned earlier, most people, they go to the county when they have an issue. They're not running up to Annapolis. They might know who their state legislators are. They might not, but they probably know, if they're engaged, who their county leaders are. And those are the people in which they interact with the most. So for a resident to be going to a county commissioner, normally they'll have an answer straight away, right? It's a local issue. For a county commissioner to say, listen, I don't have any authority, that can be frustrating for residents. And it leads to a lot of tension that we're experiencing now.
100%. And speaking of tension, I do kind of want to shift our focus now to the upcoming legislative session. What are we, a little over a month and a half away? And we know that 2025, just like 2024 was the session of housing, 2025 is going to be the session of energy. And so we already know of several bills kind of being cooked up and shared, some in draft form, some just a pair of talking points at this point. But, there's two in particular that we saw last year that I imagine are going to come back. One came from leadership in one of the committees, and that assigned county-specific targets. I'm going to really say counties, you have to come up with a plan to meet X. The challenging thing with that concept is, first of all, how do you assign targets? That is actually much more complicated. And also, as we're already saying, counties don't have a lot of tools in the energy siting space. And so even if you're going to assign a county a target to do X, Y, or Z, if we have no tools to shape that, what is the use in actually doing that exercise? The other piece of legislation has to do with something called a Certificate of Public Convenience and Necessity, or a CPCN. A CPCN is just the approval that you need to get from the state for any project above 2 megawatts. And so last year we saw a bill to streamline that application process for 2 to 5 megawatts. MACo weighed in on that bill with a number of concerns. I imagine that legislation is going to come back. The biggest thing, MACo is going to be involved in these conversations over the interim and over the session. And we want to be, a major stakeholder and a productive stakeholder because, again, we are serving our mutual constituents. I just want to underline how important it is for, as legislators reconvene in January, to focus on state goals, all of the state goals, and focus on prioritizing local realities. MACo is here, counties are here, and we want a solution to everyone's big energy headache.
Right. And I love that. And I think, Michael, I want to pick your brain for a second, because this is not about counties saying no. And I want to emphasize that again. And actually, Michael, just a few years ago, MACo had an initiative to basically ask counties to draw out maps to say, you're not going to say no, but we want you to tell us where you want the solar. And maybe these are areas that, less desirable lands. They are next to utility lines, right? So they're easily connectable. But we actually had an initiative to do that, not to say no, but to make it smarter and with more community input, right?
Right. So that's an issue that we have been engaged on, where to site the generation facilities, particularly solar. That's going to have, like Dom has been saying, the big footprint, not the one point source, but the giant big footprint. Where do you site it? And the idea of there being some deference to some local plan, like you get all these stakeholders together, you map out the county and say, these are the zones that make sense and these zones don't make sense. We want to say yes to the projects that are in the green light zones, and we want to be able to say no to the projects that are in the red light zones. And the problem is, because we've basically been preempted, we're missing the second piece. So you can come up with your map and say, this is the preferred area, and we think this is the easiest on-ramp to the existing power lines and so forth, and these are the places where we want to see solar happen. But developers can still say, well, we've got a willing seller of some ag land, and it's down here in your red zone. Sorry, you can't tell us no. So, and that's kind of the rub with the state legislation that tries to say, let's carve out for each jurisdiction a goal for them to reach. I mean, Dom, you described that as tricky. I completely agree with that. I mean, do a little thought experiment. We got hundreds of thousands of people live in Baltimore City. So what way can you come up with to, even if it's a scale down, but what if Baltimore City has to come up with 5% or 3% of all the solar energy to be used in the state that's somehow vaguely proportional to their use or to their population and so forth? Like, how on earth could you generate that kind of solar in Baltimore in a market where we see the developers would much rather go buy cheap land in flat, low-lying agricultural areas than try and deal with, you got to get a stormwater permit to build something on top of this building, and this community is too hard to build in. You got too many problems getting in and out and so forth. And think of the environmental justice issues you'd have putting up all these projects and so forth. Like, I don't know. This is tougher than meets the eye, I think.
Right. And Michael, to add one more layer to that, you mentioned earlier, a solar developer may say, hey, I got somebody willing to lease me or sell me this land. This is also a property rights issue, right? So if you set out all these targets and you say, well, County A, you're going to be responsible for X% of the state's solar. Well, that's all well and good, but that's assuming that you have enough people that are willing to lease or sell their farmland so that you can actually put these giant solar developments in your county, right? So I don't think we have a ton of county land lying around where counties would be able to say, yeah, put it here. You'd have to actually get the buy-in from your residents and from some of these people that own a lot of land. So these targets, I think, are flawed for many reasons. And Dom, the first one you mentioned earlier, which is we don't have any control over this stuff. So the state, the PSC controls that. And then again, Michael, you mentioned, what do you do with someone like Baltimore City, right? They don't have the capacity to do this. They don't have the land space to do this. And again, you have to have residents who own wide swaths of land willing to lease or sell their land to make that work. So you could easily poke holes in that plan. I understand the plan. I get it. It sounds reasonable. Once you start digging into it, it becomes problematic. And that seems like where we are. So Dom, to pivot a little bit, and I know we've been talking about this internally. You've had these discussions in stakeholder groups and with county officials. Another big piece to this puzzle is next generation nuclear. And I say next generation on purpose. Talk to us about that, Dom.
Yeah, so nuclear, this is not your granddaddy's nuclear anymore. The technology has gone through so many iterations. Now we call them, Gen 4 or small modular reactors, SMRs. That's an acronym that's thrown around quite a bit. And this is a new emerging option that is showing a ton of promise. First, they're much more affordable. They're much more scalable. The efficiency is crazy better than, 3 Mile Island or historical Calvert Cliffs. And they have advanced cooling technologies too. So before you had to have a water source and, go through all this crazy cooling stuff and God forbid a pipe blew up. Now that they use salts, so many different chemicals. So SMRs really are the future of renewable energy and probably going to be one of the only technologies we can use to realistically meet our energy goals. One of the cool things about them is think of them like a Lego set. So a Lego set, you build it block by block, brick by brick, versus a house where you just have these massive bricks. The Lego set, much smaller. That's an SMR. You can build a couple of pieces because let's say you only need, 10 megawatts instead of 1,000 megawatts, or eventually you're going to need 1,000 megawatts, but you can start building slowly to get to where you need to get. And the footprint and the infrastructure, SMRs are just super cool, and I cannot wait to bring one to Maryland.
Yeah. Okay, so quick, so honest question though, Dom, how far out are SMRs? You talk about nuclear, people often talk in 10, 20, 30 years. I know that Georgia just brought a nuclear plant online. I don't think it was the next generation style, like an SMR, but it was very, very, very expensive and very late. So I think the two criticisms you hear about nuclear are it'll never happen, it takes too long, people are scared of it, the regulatory process out of control, and the fact that it's very, very expensive. And again, people just are scared of nuclear. So what's the difference here and how long are we looking?
So important thing about the Georgia one that you just mentioned. So Georgia is actually considered like a generation 3.1. It's not really over that hurdle where it's a full generation 4 yet. So there is some older technology, and that played a lot into the delay. Now, as far as getting these generation 4 SMRs into Maryland, we're talking about 5 to 10 years. And, put a pin in that because that could change a little bit. A lot of this technology is really, already online in Europe. It's still quite new to the United States. You're not going to see one tomorrow, but I would definitely say, by the 2030s, the early 2030s, we should be able to see a few in Maryland.
And Michael, what do you do about residents who are fearful? People remember 3 Mile Island. They saw what happened in Japan not too long ago with a big tsunami. So what do you do, Michael, to quell people's fears? And how do you explain to people that it's different? Sorry to put you on the spot, but that seems like a big deal, right?
I like it. Ask the old guy about people who are going to be spooked by nuclear. No, I think it's a real issue at a couple levels. First of all, you do have a generation, my generation, who remembers 3 Mile Island and thinks of nuclear as a potentially daunting or scary sort of thing. And so you do have like maybe a community level or a society level question about, are we ready to embrace this? I think adjacent to that, though, is just the politics of, the universe who's in favor of clean energy and recently has been promoting, like, we want more wind and we want more solar. These are true renewable sources, right? So you can just spin the windmill in the wind and it's a fully renewable resource, and that's your best possible source of energy. Well, a nuclear plant of any size is non-carbon emissions. So you're not burning coal or oil or gas or any of these hydrocarbons that leave you with some of the climate impacts that we're worried about. But if they convey this safety issue, what happens if something goes wrong and so forth. So do you have a workable coalition that says we want clean energy in this source and that accomplishes our goals, as well as more wind and more solar. I don't know how that happens. Like, I think that's an American society political debate more than just a Maryland one. But I will say, the one thing nuclear brings you in addition to what wind and solar can is the more like flip the switch reliability. Like if you are short production in a region, it's hard to go out and talk to people who have these big dispersed solar plants and say, hey, can you fire things up and send us some more electrons because we need a little bit more here or there. You can do that with a giant coal-fired plant. You can do it with a giant oil-fired plant, and you can do it with a nuclear reactor. You can say, we need you to run 24 hours a day for the next 6 weeks to meet this capacity. And even these potentially smaller scale, these modular units, potentially can be part of the solution on that front. So I'm no expert on the policy here. I think the politics are really interesting, both getting old people like me over their fear. We watched the China Syndrome, and that was a powerful movie, and that was a compelling thing back in the day. I don't know what it'll take to get past, geezers like me being worried about it into futurists like Dom who want to embrace it.
It's like bell-bottom jeans. They're back in vogue.
No, I mean, I will say I was talking to a climate activist the other day, older person, and this person said, look, I was marching against nuclear way back when, right? And when 3 Mile happened, I was there. And now this new technology, though, this person seemed to be embracing it and saying that it can be done differently. It is safer, and it does help to meet our clean energy demand. So maybe that's shifting a bit when people learn about this new technology, but I still think there will be people who hear the word nuclear and go apoplectic, right? And it's understandable. And I think maybe the new generation will become more aware of this technology and not so resistant or scared of it, but we'll see. But look, I think that the bottom line is Maryland, we have very aggressive climate goals. We are trying to lead the nation, but the bottom line is, fossil fuels, coal, oil, natural gas, they've been powering economies around the world for 150 years. And I think, those fuels power right now about 80% of the world's energy. So it's hard to get away from that. Maryland is trying to lead the charge here, but it's going to be difficult. These fossil fuels are in everything we use. They're in your toothbrushes, right? So, getting away from that is going to be difficult, but I think it is commendable Maryland's trying to lead the way, and we are trying to find a middle ground when it comes to this, to land use stuff and transmission infrastructure, and making sure that we can balance livability issues with, again, the need for more energy and more clean energy. So it's clear that we have a lot of work to do to balance all of these priorities, Dom: energy, conservation, community concerns, all of that stuff, a lot of work to do moving forward. And we're certainly going to be talking about this at the upcoming MACo Winter Conference. Unshameful plug there.
Yeah, so we will be exploring these topics at Winter MACo. Hope to see you there in the sunny Hyatt in Cambridge. We have 2 sessions, not one, but 2 sessions dedicated to energy. First, we have Powering Maryland, a roundtable on the state's energy landscape, and that will be Wednesday, December 11th at 10:30 a.m. I cannot think of anything I'd rather do at 10:30 a.m. than talk about energy. And then for those of you who are hurting for double trouble, we have Building for the Future, Electrification, Renewables, and Emerging Technologies. That is also Wednesday at 1:30. So we hit you at breakfast, we hit you at lunch, and hopefully you're energied out for the day.
Right. No, I think, this is us reading the room, right? When MACo puts together our events for education and informing our members, like, we want to have our finger on the pulse of things that they're talking about. So over the course of the spring, summer, and fall, when County Executive Olszewski and I, were traveling and meeting with governing bodies, this was a topic that kept coming up. So no surprise that it ends up being peppered into the content for our winter conference. And we're always trying to forecast issues that we think will be interesting and high profile in the legislative session when we do a conference in December or January as a lead up. So it's just smart for us to try and anticipate this is going to be a hot topic. Let's get some of the players together in December and talk about this stuff, because a lot of those players will be at the table negotiating or testifying come February when there's legislation or new policy. And so that's the right thing for us to do. And it also helps to establish MACo as like, we want to be part of the solution on this, and to try and find some balance and try and find some reasonable ways to green light the smart ways to do all the stuff that we need to do.
Yeah, I think that this will be a very, very, very fruitful topic at MACoCon, and not just in the sessions that Dom mentioned, which should be overflowing out of the room, but also, just in line, waiting for ice cream or whatever it is at the Hyatt. People are going to be talking about energy. They're going to be talking about the budget. I think those two issues dominate the next session for sure. And Dom, one other piece of this that I neglected to mention earlier that we should mention, there is an idea, and we have at least one county doing this, and they're working with the solar industry to do it. This idea of the solar industry coming into Maryland and saying, hey, we're here to provide clean energy. We're also here to make money. So what we're going to do is we're going to put some of that profit back into conservation. And I know that some of those talks have been on the table. I think it's a really good idea, but I also know that maybe the political landscape has changed enough to where the industry might not be in favor of that concept anymore. Any update on that concept? Because I do think it's a good one.
It is an idea that we are actively exploring. I just want to say, I think what's unique about that is, again, Maryland, we are a small state with really big goals. And so instead of having goals that are competing, let's start using one to drive the other. That is better policymaking. And so we're still looking at that idea, and we're still looking at other ideas to make sure that we can do all of the great things we want to do.
All right. Well, energy policy is certainly complex, but understanding it is essential as Maryland navigates its ambitious goals. And again, we do have some of the most ambitious climate goals in the country. So we're going to be talking about that and a whole lot more at the MACo Winter Conference. Please look in the show notes for links for the Winter Conference, how you can register, what you need to do. All that stuff will be in the show notes. We'll also have some links to some stuff Dom has written, really good in-depth articles on the state of energy in Maryland and what MACo is trying to do to make things more reasonable and workable for our local communities. But we'll go ahead and leave it there for today. If you enjoy the podcast, please go ahead and subscribe. That way, all of these episodes will be sent directly to the device of your choice. You can also follow along on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and then, of course, you should be reading the Conduit Street blog. But for my co-hosts, Michael Sanderson and Dom Butchko, and for our esteemed producer, Chantel Malcolm Lim, this is Kevin Kinnally signing off, and we will talk to you soon.